The night is quiet, and the steppe seems to breathe. In that wide dark, a small fire glows, and a name rises from old pages. Attila. Many later writers called him the Scourge of God, the divine punisher sent to wake a tired empire. But who was the man behind the thunderous title? Did he live in a tent full of gold, or in a saddle that never cooled? Did he really plan to tear Rome apart, or did he prefer gold and treaties to smashed stones? And how did his story end? In battle, in intrigue, or in a hush that surprised even his enemies? Tonight we will walk slowly through his world, the grasslands that made fast riders, the camp that stretched like a moving city, the talks with emperors that felt like chess, and the myths that grew when those talks were over. If you enjoy this calm pace, you can simply listen and breathe. In a moment, we will meet a boy on the steppe before the legends found him. Before the legend, there was a boy and a horizon that never seemed to end. The grass was the first teacher. It told you when to move herds, when to find water, when to let horses rest. In the morning the air felt thin and clean, almost like a bell, and hooves made a soft drum on the ground. A camp lifted itself with the sunsmoke from small fires. Women knotting ropes, men checking girths, and then folded again by noon, when wind asked for a different valley. Many historians think Attila's childhood began inside this rhythm, not in a palace but in a moving household, where a wagon's shadow was a familiar roof. In a moment, we will watch how a child's hands learned the bow before his name was known. Beyond a circle of tents, Hunnic life asked children to be useful, early, but it did not ask loudly. A boy started with gentle jobs, leading a foal, carrying water in a leather bucket that sloshed like a sleepy lake, learning how to pack a felt cover so it did not flap in the wind. The composite bow hung high at first, out of reach, more symbol than tool. When he could hold it steady, an elder would lower it with a smile that meant both pride and warning. The thumb ring, if there was one, felt too big on the first try, and the string made a small smarting line on skin that soon grew tough. Hitting a target was less important than drawing without hurting yourself or the horse. In a moment, the horse itself will become the real classroom. Steppe horses were compact and wise, born to the wind and sure about their feet. A child learned to ride bareback before he learned to write any letters, because letters were not the family trade. He could doze on a pony's warm back while the herd moved, wake to a whistle, and guide with knees more than with reins. Many historians think Hunnic boys learned a two-body balance animal and ride along before they faced any enemy. The horse reminded you to breathe when your own chest forgot. Children practiced mounting from either side, sharing the saddle with a friend as a game that taught grace more than speed. In a moment, the camp itself will open so you can see how many homes could move like one. Picture a circle of wagons, wheels dug in, with felt tents inside the ring, and tether lines for animals radiating outward like spokes. The cooking fire was small, the pot was big. The soup was simple, meat, milk, grain, when a trade had gone well. There were tools in every spare corner, bone needles, awls, kettles with the memory of many stews. Instead of streets there were paths, worn by hooves and sandals, and the city walls were weather and distance. The camp could grow into a little town when allied clans visited, then shrank again to one family in bad weather. This was a kind of freedom Roman writers barely understood, and it made fear easy to cultivate later. In a moment, we will look at families and the ties that made strangers into kin. Kinship on the steppe was both blood and oath. You had cousins by birth and cousins by choice. Marriage stitched tents together across long miles, and foster ties did the same for children. A boy might spend seasons in another household to learn skills or to seal a promise between elders. The loan made friends into brothers. These arrangements were practical, but they also trained the heart to switch saddles without losing balance. You learned other dialects, other favorite foods, other jokes, and you saw how leadership could look gentle in one tent and stern in another. In a moment, we return to our opening question, how power had no face yet, and we will see how a future ruler first learned to listen. Authority lived under many hats in the Hunnic world. A respected elder could end a quarrel with a few plain words. A skilled herder could decide when to move, and everyone would follow because animals obeyed him first. A brave raider could attract followers with luck and gifts, but luck without Gifts did not last. A boy watched these models and learned that command sprang from usefulness. He saw that a leader who gave away more than he kept people longer. This kind of arithmetic wrote itself in meals shared and coats pressed into cold hands. In a moment, steppe seasons will slide past, and you will feel how weather trained strategy long before Rome did. Winter on the steppe taught patience, spring taught speed. Rivers swelled and shrank, grass grew like a promise, and then crisped. In hot wind, camps moved with pasture, and the map changed every week, even if you stayed in the same wide region. A boy learned the names of 24 streams better than any city street. He learned where reeds whispered of fish, and where a hill could hide riders from a far watcher. Strategy, for a child, was simply knowing that the world was large, and that you could still feel at home in it. In a moment, we will add neighbors to the picture, because no horizon belongs to one people. The Huns did not live alone. Goths grazed not far away. Alans and Sarmatians rode different bloodlines of horses, and traders came from Roman forts carrying wine, grain, fabrics, and news. A boy might hear 3 languages before lunch, his own tongue at the fire. Gothic at a cattle exchange, rough Latin at a fence line. He would learn gestures that meant fair wait, and gestures that meant try again. Many historians think the Hunnic language is lost to us, except for scraps, so it is hard to know how words filled his mouth at first. But it is likely that, by his teens, he could manage several tongues enough to trade or threaten politely. In a moment, that polite edge will matter, because peace often hung by a thread of words. Some days looked like treaty days. Elders sat on felt, cups passed, and a boy poured water for men who kept their eyes steady even when they disagreed. Gifts were weighed and matched cloth for horses, iron for hides, a daughter's hand for a winter pasture right. A young Attila, if he was there, learned who spoke first, who let silence do half the work, and who only pretended not to understand a phrase to gain time. Trade routes poured through these talks like hidden rivers, and tribute from Roman forts could be called gifts if the room needed a softer word. In a moment, the bow will return, but it will share space with a different craft, the making of peace that could turn into skill at demanding more. Archery gave a boy pride in his arms. Speaking gave him pride in his timing. He would ride out with friends and shoot at moving targets, then return to camp and watch elders move words into position like pieces on a board. Both games asked for distance and closeness at the same time. On horseback, you learned to strike from far and escape. In council, you learned to hint and wait. The child who became the figure we remember would have been trained in both, without anyone naming them as separate schools. In a moment, we'll look at childhood hazards, not battles, but the softer tests that made a leader or broke one. Hunger was the first hazard. If a winter ran long or a summer ran hard, herds suffered and tempers shortened. The lesson was not punishment, it was endurance. You learned which grass revived first, which river froze shallow, which clan shared even when it hurt. Illness came, and went with the wind. A shaman or healer might burn herbs and murmur words to steady a fevered child. Many historians think the Huns honored sky and earth in ways that felt simple and strong, without heavy temples. A boy would grow used to signs, the flight of birds, a dream before a journey, the shape of clouds over a plain, because adults read them as part of planning. In a moment, we return to our hook. The title Divine Punisher is far away, but you can already feel how belief shaped behavior. The camp's ceremonies were modest, but they held the group together. Before a long ride, elders might pour a little milk on the ground and ask the road to be kind. After a safe return, meat shared in order of seniority reminded everyone who was who. A child saw that ritual could be a quiet fence that kept pride from wandering. He learned that even confident men touched amulets or knots in their bridles when thunder walked by. Reverence did not make them slow. It simply taught them that the world had moods. In a moment, we stepped toward the border where steppe met empire. Along great rivers like the Danube, the moving world met the world of walls. Roman forts gleamed like teeth in the sun, and markets grew near them because soldiers bought what they could not grow. A Hunnic boy visiting those edges would see straight roads that did not care about hills, men in heavy armor that clicked like beetles, and dogs that barked at scents no steppe dog cared about. He would also see fear and curiosity mix in equal parts when his people appeared at the gates with horses and goods. It is likely he tasted wine there for the first time and thought it was too proud for its own throat. In a moment, hostages and foster ties will drift across those borders, and a broader lesson will settle. Hostages sound harsh to modern ears, but in late antiquity they often worked like high-level hostage. A leader sent a son or nephew to the other side to learn language and customs, and to keep both parties honest. Many historians think Attila himself may have been shaped by men who had moved in both worlds, and later he would use hostages and envoys with the ease of someone who knew the taste. A boy raised in a mixed boundary would see Romans not as monsters but as partners who needed firm speech and reminders. That is how tribute would later become policy rather than pillage. In a moment, we will come back to the grass, because all power rested finally on the herds. Horses, sheep, cattle, and the people who kept them were the breathing treasury of the steppe. If herds were healthy, men were free to ride far. If herds failed, everything else bent. A child saw wealth measured in hooves rather than marble. He watched women turn milk into drink and curds, watched men trim manes and shoes, watched children count animals at dusk as carefully as a scribe counts coins. Gold mattered later, when treaties flowed, but even then the herds gave the confidence that let a leader speak boldly. In a moment, the sound of wheels will return, because wagons were the home that made long plans possible. Wagon wheels creaked like music. They carried spare bows, iron bits, felt walls, sleeping children, and old stories. And they made the Confederation mobile in a way city people found strange. Where a stone house anchored one family, a wagon allowed one family to become many by moving toward cousins and away from trouble. A boy learned to grease an axle, to wrap a cracked spoke with leather until a better repair could be made, to lift a wheel with a lever rather than with pride. These small acts of care kept a people from breaking. In a moment, you will notice how this lifetime of motion, trade, and listening prepared a young rider to become a ruler who knew when to press and when to pause. By the time the name Attila began to carry weight, the man behind it had spent decades learning the steps to big lessons. Nothing stays still, and everything is connected. Grass to horse, horse to rider, rider to caravan, caravan to fort, fort to emperor, emperor to treaty, treaty to herd again. A child who breathed that rhythm could one day look at a map and see not lines but flows. He would know that fear could be turned into payments, and that promises, once kept publicly, could be demanded again with a calm face. We return to the quiet fire of our hook, and the question in it: did he prefer gold and treaties to smashed stones? And the origin story suggests an answer. A stepchild values what feeds the herd. In a moment, we will walk with him from rider to ruler. We will see how brothers shared power, how gifts and marriages and hostages made a net strong enough to catch tribute by the waggaload, and how a man with a simple wooden cup could sit before silk-robed envoys and make them sweat. The boy has learned his bows, his horses, his languages, and his silences. The steppe has given him a spine and a strategy without calling it either. Now the tent grows larger, the circle of wagons wider, and the horizon begins to include cities he will never live in but will reach with a letter or a glance. For tonight, breathe once more with the grass, and keep the soft truth close. Before the thunder, there was the rhythm of hoofs, and in that rhythm, a leader learned to listen. Power arrived to him the way a river becomes a lake slowly, with many streams feeding it. After years of riding and listening, Attila stepped into leadership beside his brother, a man many sources call Blader. The seat they shared was not a marble throne. It was a saddle and a felt mat under a low tent, where elders could sit, speak, and be seen. The confederation they led was wide and uneven, made of Huns and allied peoples who kept their own chiefs and pride. Holding such a web together took more than a hard voice. It took gifts given at the right moment, marriages that stitched tents together, and treaties that turned fear into income. In a moment, we will stand by the big river and watch the first steady gold cross it. The Danube, wide and patient, marked a meeting place. On one side, forts and roads. On the other, riders and wagons. When Attila and Blader negotiated with Eastern Roman envoys, the words changed shape. But the deal was simple. The empire would send gold, return certain fugitives, and open specific markets. The Huns would keep raids on a short leash. Many historians think early agreements did not make anyone blush. Tribute rose when pressure rose and fell when both sides exhaled. To a steppe mind, that gold felt like rain on dry grass, turning horses strong and camp stores honest. In a moment, we will peek at the unseen threads, hostages, and foster ties that kept these agreements from fraying. Overnight. Hostages in late antiquity often acted like living treaties. A chief sent a nephew, an emperor sent a relative of rank. Both sides promised good treatment. The young people learned languages, manners, and the rhythm of the other house. When letters later crossed the river, they were not just wax and ink, they were memory and a first name. Attila understood this well. He sent and received people as pledges, and those pledges softened the edge of threats. A man is slower to disappoint someone who knows his childhood laugh. In a moment, we'll step into a wedding tent and see how marriage could bind more firmly than a signature. Marriages among steppe elites braided clans across long miles. A daughter might ride to the camp of a Gothic ally. A Hunnic princess might arrive with a dowry that was half family, half treaty. The gifts moved in both directions: horses, silver, fine cloth, iron tools, and the songs that followed spoke of loyalty first and romance second. There is a calm practicality in these unions. They spread risk and multiplied cousins. When trouble came, a rider could send for help and call not only on allies but on in-laws. Attila and Bleda used such ties to steady their edges while they looked toward the river and its markets. In a moment, you will see how gifts, when given wisely, act like rope rather than glitter. Gifts traveled by wagon, saddles stitched with care, swords with clean lines, furs brushed to a shine, and the animals themselves, short, strong horses that seemed to carry the wind. Within the Confederation, giving downward kept loyalty warm, giving outward kept neighbors polite. A chief who returned from an embassy with hands full did not hold everything tight. He sprinkled wealth like a man watering fields. That public generosity was a lesson to rivals and a promise to followers. Rome noticed the tribute that crossed the Danube did not vanish into one tent. It moved through the web, turning potential quarrels into quiet nods. In a moment, we will return to the riverbank and watch the bargaining dance grow sharper. Tribute rose when treaties bent. A border town would quarrel. A fort commander would misread an order. A local governor would let markets close. Then riders appeared like a sudden cloud. Not a storm war, like a gust that rattled shutters and the pressure invited a new meeting. Numbers went up. Promises were restated. Markets reopened. From the Roman point of view, this felt like paying for peace. From the steppe side, it felt like charging rent for using their patience and their roads. Many historians think Attila learned to measure how hard to press, so that gold continued like a river in flood season, but bridges did not wash away. In a moment, we will look at the seats of rule themselves, and how two brothers divided, being feared and being followed, shared. Rule is delicate. Attila and Bleda appear in sources as partners at first, each with a circle of followers, each with authority over parts of the Confederation. The picture is not crystal clear, but it is likely they balanced roles. One might lead hunts and feasts, the other stand longer at the treaty table. One charm allies, the other check the ledgers of tribute and gifts. They both had to show strength, without biting the same apple at once. When messages went out to allied chiefs, they carried both names until the web felt the pull of one voice more than the other. The steppe teaches a lesson here. Two riders can guide one herd if they lean the same way at the same moment. In a moment, a quiet garden of numbers will open. How much gold, how often, and why it mattered more than captured walls. We like to think of conquest as a pile of cities, but many steppe rulers preferred piles of coin and herds that did not die. Tribute was predictable in a way plunder could never be. It arrived in set measures, sometimes yearly, sometimes after each embassy, and it could be planned into winter stores and summer gifts. It bought iron, which bought arrowheads, which bought confidence, which bought more gold. It also reduced risk. A dead soldier is a permanent loss. A chest of coins is a flexible tool. To a people who moved with seasons, steady payment was the music they could plan dances to. In a moment, we will notice how envoys, those quiet travelers with pens and good shoes, became part of Attila's toolkit. Envoys crossed and recrossed the Danube like swans. They watched eyes more than lips, weighed rooms as if they were coins, and carried messages folded inside other messages. Attila's circles learned their faces and their habits, noted the men who arrived nervous and the ones who hid it under perfume. A calm leader reads such details as weather. He knows when to request a better rate, when to demand a runaway return, when to switch the meeting place to remind the other side whose ground they are on. Many historians think Attila preferred talking first because talking paid better, and because a treaty could build a path for the next treaty. Somewhere along the middle Danube, a holy place became a point of pride for men who did not share the same gods. A local commander pushed Hunnic riders replied. The affair turned hot. Rather than let heat ruin a season, the brothers used the flair to expand their terms. The empire would pay more and give clearer guarantees. The Huns would hold lines tighter and keep a lid on raids that were not blessed. This pattern repeated. It made Roman writers grumble and made steppe accountants smile. It also trained everyone to see Attila as a ruler who could trade thunder for rain. In a moment, we will look at the home side of this machine, how the wealth that arrived did not sour the camp. Wealth without stone walls needs managers, not only warriors. Herds multiplied, wagons filled. Artisans worked leather and iron for a court that could move at a day's notice. Chiefs arrived to be seen and fed, and left with gifts that were equal in weight to their expectations. Attila's power grew in the space between feast and rule. He kept his own person plain, if later observers can be trusted, simple wooden cup, modest dress so that gifts around him looked like the people's wealth, not his vanity. That plainness was a kind of theater too, and it made envoys blink. In a moment, we will bring our opening line back into the room. Is this a punisher or a planarand? Rest in the soft answer. The title, Divine Punisher, came from frightened neighbors who needed a reason for their troubles. But the man who earned it seems, in many pages, to have preferred predictable rivers of gold to piles of broken stone. He punished when it paid. He paused when payment promised more. Tribute felt like rain to someone raised under wide skies. It made grass grow, horses strong, and allies loyal. The steppe had taught him that strength is a circle. Gifts by riders, riders by pressure, pressure buys treaties, treaties buy gifts again. We return to the boy by the fire from the first hour and see him as a man by a larger fire, making the same careful moves. In a moment, we'll step inside the camp itself and sit quietly in the space where wagons make a town, to watch how rank, food, and decorum turned this river of gold into a working court that could move at sunrise. The camp did not look like a palace, but it felt like a city that could stand up and walk. Wagons formed long streets of wheels and poles, felt tense, breathed like living things when wind moved. Pastures wrapped around it, all like a wide green moat. At the center stood a larger hall, timber and plank if the season allowed, canvas and felt if the road had been long, with a clear open space before its door. Smoke rose in even lines, fires spaced as if measured by a rope, and water barrels sat with lids tied, a small sign of a house that liked order. Many historians think Attila preferred this moving town to any fixed stone, because it could stretch, to welcome allies and tighten to protect itself within a day. In a moment, we will step closer and see how strict hosts made guests feel. Both watched and honored. Guards sat their horses at the edges, wrapped in cloaks that hid scale and leather. Their eyes did most of the work. They noticed new wagons by the way dust sat on a wheel, and new men by the way they placed their feet when they thought no one was looking. A messenger could be inside the camp and drinking a cup of water in less time than it takes to cross a market, but only if someone had sent for him. Hospitality here moved on rails. If you were welcome, you knew it quickly. If you were not, you felt only polite doors. That careful welcome was not just pride. It was policy, news, tribute, and people flowed through this place like rivers, and rivers are tamed by banks. In a moment, you will enter the main hall where banks took the form of benches, bowls, and the simplest wooden cup in Europe. A visitor from Constantinople once described a feast where silver and gold glittered around the room, but the host chose wood, Attila sat with a wooden cup and a plain plate, while his chiefs lifted heavy metal goblets that caught firelight. He allowed songs and jokes, but he kept his face steady and his voice quiet. The message traveled farther than the music. Riches belong to the people. The leader stays made of the same wood as the camp. Whether he believed this in his bones or used it as theater hardly matters. The effect was real. Enemies heard of the simplicity and grew nervous. Followers saw it and steadied. In a moment, look up and notice the roof, because the ceiling itself told a rule. From the rafters hung saddles and tack, far from sparks. Boughs slept on pegs so their sinew could rest. Quivers lay closed. Nothing lay on the floor near the long tables, except rugs and feet. It was the same lesson as in the yard of a barracks. Objects have homes, and when they live there, people are safer. Food arrived in courses that were not courses in our sense, but waves from a sea of kettles. Roasted meat that came to the hand still hot. Bread that broke clean along its seams. Stews heavy with bone and fat when the season asked for it. Wine moved in measured cups. On other days, milk drinks arrived, sharp in the nose and honest in the throat. Music was not for noise. It was a rope that held the evening together. In a moment, the room will turn into a courtroom without changing. A bench, feasts doubled as councils. A guest picked up by reputation would find himself seated, just close enough to hear quiet questions and far enough to understand his place. Attila spoke little at first. He allowed others to speak themselves, into clarity or into error. Rank showed in distance from the host, in the weight of a cup, in how a dish visited one bench before another. Equality showed in the shared pot and shared air. No one ate alone. And laughter, when it visited, was allowed to cross the room. The line between rough equality and sharp rank was always visible and always crossed deliberately by ceremony. You could rise, but you did not drift. In a moment, we will step outside again, because the city that walked also worked. Beyond the hall, the camp hummed like a market, where money had been replaced by favors and memory. Smiths shaped iron into arrowheads, on low anvils that rang like small bells. Leatherworkers oiled saddles until the color of the hide looked like wet stone. Women spun and wove, prepared hides, set up the cooking spaces where kettles made a steady music. Children drove sheep through lanes between ropes with the seriousness of little merchants. Traders threaded the edges with cloth and wine, salt, and stories telling that the safest way to sell was to follow the rules about where to tie a rope and where not to light a fire. Tribute from the river turned into meat and tools here, not just into pride. In a moment, watch how messages crossed this moving city without getting lost. Runners carried words with a formal start and finish. They did not shout a name into a crowd. They found a steward and received a token, a carved chip, a knot of cord that gave them the right to step into the hall or to stand at its edge. Add that to the posted rotations of watch and work, and you begin to see a cord that did not need parchment to remember everything. It taught the body to do part of the remembering. A visiting envoy would see no marble inscriptions, but he would feel something just as firm, a pattern of movement that held shape. Many historians think this is why envoys wrote of strict hosts. Strict did not mean cruel. It meant that the tent had walls even when no wood stood. In a moment, we will sit with the women for a respectful minute, because power rested on their skill as much as on bows. A quiet corner of the camp held looms that measured the seasons in cloth. The women made coats that flexed with riding and held warmth in cold winds. They braided reins and hair, braided stories into the next day's tasks. A chief's wife might welcome a visitor in a smaller hall with woven walls and plain furniture, and the visitor would notice that even here, the rule of order held. A cup did not travel across a table without a cloth beneath it. Spindles sat upright like small trees. Children copied that calm with their toys. If someone asked where the riches of the Huns lived, the honest answer was here in hands, skills, and habits more than in any pit of coin. In a moment, return to the center fire and watch how justice was done without a robe. Disputes did not need a marble court. If a horse changed owners badly, or if a promise about sheep went thin, men spoke across a narrow space while elders listened. The question was not only who was right, but how the camp would still walk tomorrow. Compensation often traveled as animals and tools, not as blows. A fine made a herd lighter, but the camp quieter. a gift to a wronged hand, stitched a hole that words could not. Attila did not rule every quarrel. He chose the ones that taught. This, too, is strict hosting, guarding the room from grudges as carefully as from fire. In a moment, we will lower our eyes to table level and notice the small markers of rank. That did not cost fear. A woven mat might be thicker under one man than another. A cup might be heavier in one hand than in the next. Meat might visit a bench slightly earlier, and eyes would catch that and file it. You, today, are closer to the center. You, today, must endure a small wait. These adjustments cost nothing, but meant everything. They allowed a confederation made of many proud lineages to see themselves in the same room without snapping teeth. When tribute arrived from the Danube in neat stacks, it did not disappear. It was turned into such signals, and those signals multiplied. In a moment, we will return to the wooden cup that began our visit, because that small object held a larger idea. Imagine the hush when a silver goblet passes you and you are not offered it. Then the warmth when a plain wooden cup lands in your hand and you notice the host is lifting the same. It says enough without a speech. It says, "The shine in this room belongs to us, not to me." It also says, "I can ask you to be content with less because I am content with less." A leader who eats from wood while gold sits nearby makes a story that servants carry two rivals for free. Envoys write it down and make it travel farther. In a soft way, it becomes tribute's Kuzanin image, paid out to keep coins coming in. In a moment, look at the animals again, because camp life kept rank. Gentle by keeping everyone close to the herd. Horses pressed their warm breath against hands that had argued 2 hours earlier, and the quarrel shrank in the steam. Sheep reminded chiefs that supply is not a speech, it is a count. When riders mounted at dusk for a patrol, the man who had sat near the host and the man who had sat near the door stepped into the same wind and felt the same need for a girth. Rough equality lived in those small winds. Sharp rank lived in the spaces before the hearth. The camp kept both because it needed both. A family can share stew and still know who must speak first at the next meeting. In a moment, the night will come, and you will hear the court settle like a tent in good weather. After dark, the hall dimmed rather than vanished. A singer might rise and give a short piece, something about speed and patience, about a hunt that ended well because no one shouted at the river. Men in the doorway stood aside so messengers could move. Dogs arranged themselves like polite stones. Near the warmest corners, Attila sometimes asked a brief question at this hour, a small test. Who remembered the distances between tomorrow's camps? Who knew the price of hides last week at the river market? If answers came smooth, the night ended smooth. If not, a quiet plan was made before sleep to refill the gaps. In a moment, morning will return, because this court renewed itself every sunrise without a bell. Dawn meant horses first, then fire, then faces washed with the same care a soldier shows a blade. The hall reset itself with practice that looked like ease. Benches moved, balls nested, floors were swept with brooms that remembered where to go. Tributes and letters might arrive that day. Scouts might return from a Roman road or a Gothic camp. Envoys could need chairs and questions. Yet the place never felt rushed. It felt measured, as if the wind were an assistant rather than a master. Many historians think this ability to be ready for both feast and embassy before the camp had finished waking was the Hunnic court's true power. It could negotiate without leaving home, because home could follow the negotiation. In a moment, we will take the calm we found here to the road, where treaties were pressed and maps traced with fingers over river dust. Hold the image of the wooden cup, the strict host, the laughter that stayed in its lane, the guards whose eyes made walls, and the wagons that could make a city appear and disappear like a tent trick. This is the seat around which gold from the Danube turned into a working web. This is where morning news became afternoon policy and evening song. When Attila moved from this circle toward the Balkans or Gaul, he carried a court that already knew how to sit, listen, and eat in order. The camp taught him how to be feared without shouting, and how to be followed without begging. In a moment, we will ride with the envoys and watch threats turn into payments and maps into promises, all at a pace that matched a horse's breath. The road to negotiation began before the first handshake. Scouts rode ahead of the envoys and watched ferries, counted wagons, noted how many cooking fires burned on a hill. They measured mood with their eyes. If markets near the river were open and busy, the meeting would be warm. If shutters hung crooked and dogs barked at night, a harder path lay ahead. Attila liked meetings where both sides understood what the season could bear. When grass was high and horses fat, his smile could be thin. When rain had washed roads and winter still pressed on stores, his voice, many historians think, grew more patient. In a moment, we will stand on the bank where oars and words touched the same water. Embassies often met within reach of the Danube's breath. A Roman boat slid across, loaded more with silk and syntax than with soldiers. Hunnic riders waited, on a slope with cloaks drawn tight against wind. The first exchange was simple and old bread. Salt, a cup that made strangers briefly kin. Then came the dance of names and titles, spoken in an order that mattered, because order saves pride. An interpreter's hands moved like birds, catching meaning before it fell. The envoy had letters with wax seals that smelled faintly of warm rooms. The steppe had eyes that read how fast those letters were meant to be opened. In a moment, the talk will step inside a tent and settle on the real board. Maps did not always lie flat. Sometimes they were drawn on sand with a stick, sometimes traced on leather with a knife tip, sometimes carried on the backs of the envoys. Tongues fought names, bridge names, the markets that opened on summer days and refused winter. Attila understood the map that mattered most, where Roman gold could travel without complaint, and where it caught on local pride. The terms sounded familiar. Return this runaway, raise that payment, reopen those fairs. But the tune changed with each meeting. He pressed, without breaking the music. He pointed to a town that had shut its gates to Hunnic traders, and called the closure an insult. The Romans called it a safety measure. Both were true, and the truth was a lever. In a moment, the lever will move. He would let the envoy speak first, and let him speak long. Words reveal where weaknesses live. A Roman who mentioned brigands too often told you which road mattered to him. A letter that spent ink on fugitives told you who had slipped away and what stories they carried. Attila took such lines and wove them into a demand that seemed polite on its face, a higher tribute to repair the insult, a tighter promise on the runaway clause, a schedule that suited steppe calendars rather than palace banquets. Many historians think he raised numbers in calm steppes so an emperor could agree without looking foolish to his own court. In a moment, a memory from an earlier envoy will walk into the tent and sit down beside today's letter. Travelers from Constantinople left descriptions of these meetings that still glow. One spoke of timber halls built in open fields, and of a leader who preferred a simple cup, while others drank from heavy metal. Another noticed that Attila allowed no drunkenness to spoil the hour when decisions were shaped. The wooden cup remains in our minds because it worked like a story inside the negotiation. It said, "I do not need what you think I need. I need fairness that feeds my people." It also whispered, "I can afford to be plain because the gold on your boat will soon be counted on my side of the bank." In a moment, we will watch how threats were folded into courtesies without losing their teeth. Pressure came in small, tidy parcels. A rider delivered news that a patrol had appeared near a fort. A lost herd was found grazing on disputed land. A friendly chief reminded the envoy that certain gates had been shut against his cousins last winter. None of this sounded like a charge, but together it made a weight that numbers could lift. Attila preferred to set a price rather than break a wall. He had learned from the river that current persuades better than ice. When he wanted more, he angled the current at a bend, where Roman fear already pooled Balkan towns tired of repairs, frontier units short of pay, a governor who dreaded being blamed for a closed market. In a moment, the envoy will ask for time, and time will be turned into a coin. Delays were their own currency. The empire asked for weeks to reply. Attila asked for interest in the form of hostages or early partial payments. A nephew crossed the water to live for a season in the camp. A chest of coin arrived as a sign of good faith. These gestures smoothed the road toward a bigger wagon later. Hostages carried more than risk. They carried language and meals and memories. When they returned, there were bridges with beating hearts. Many historians think this steady weaving gold people. Promises made raiding less necessary in the years when treaties held. In a moment, we will see what happened when a small clause tripped the whole arrangement. There were times when Rome returned fugitives with empty hands. They escaped us, or when markets promised in one treaty were closed by a nervous provincial who liked his sleep. Those breaks were opportunities. Attila would amplify a single misterm into a charge of bad faith, and demand a new treaty that washed the old one away with larger numbers. The envoy protested that local officials were to blame. Attila answered with the steady face of a man who did not mind whether the emperor or the governor paid, as long as the river rose on schedule. The word punisher must have felt easy to men who watched these totals climb. But to Attila, the arithmetic still looked like grass and herds. In a moment, the sticks in the sand will beam with new lines, and a bridge will move. Meeting places changed by plan. If the last treaty was signed on the Roman bank, the next might be signed on the far shore, or in a neutral island market, where boatmen kept careful count of sacks and barrels. The river watched these choices like a judge. Each new place said something about leverage. Attila often invited envoys into his camp to negotiate the second or third step of a deal, letting order speak where marble usually did. There, the envoy saw guards who did not fidget, bowls that arrived in fair waves, and the plain cup lifted by the man he had been taught to fear. Theater again, but also truth. In a moment, paper will thicken into wagons, because agreements here ended in wood and leather. When talks closed, tribute moved. Not a number on parchment, but weight on axles, silver and gold, sealed in sacks and chests. Scales set by men whose fingers had a reputation for honesty. Hunnic handlers counted with a rhythm that felt like song 2-3-5 and Roman. Clerks wrote with fast hands to keep up. Then the road took over. Wagons rolled toward pastures and workshops, and the river lay shining behind them like a signed line on an invisible map. Gifts moved the other way, as well horses, fur, pieces of ironwork that reminded Romans why peace was cheaper. In a moment, news will arrive that the Western court has a different appetite, and the chessboard will widen. Attila's web reached toward the Western Empire to where courts in Ravenna and later in Milan played their own games with claimants and generals. Letters carried respect and hints on both sides. A promise to support one side of a dynastic quarrel could become a lever for payment or pasture rights. The same skills worked hostages, deadlines, measured threats, but the terrain differed, and messengers took longer to return. Attila learned to hold both games in one hand, squeezing here while relaxing there, never pushing so hard the two fronts hardened at once. Many historians think this balancing act shows a planner more than a mad raider. In a moment, a misstep in Constantinople will hand him his largest bargaining chip yet. When a Roman courtier forged a letter and mocked Hunnic honor, so one line of tradition claims, the insult ripened what was already a heavy branch. Attila demanded the man and the gold that would make amends. The demand could not be met fully without blood at court, so halfway payments and apologies tried to fill the gap. They did not. Pressure rose to marching speed. The river knew the sound of hooves again. We returned to our calm question from the hooked it. He preferred gold or stones, and notice the answer did not change even now. He used movement to make coin flow, and only when coin failed did he turn the movement toward walls. In a moment, the road will open into the Balkans, and then into Gaul, where a wide plain will become a page that storytellers still read to us today. Carry the image of the stick drawing borders in sand, the interpreter's hands, the polite slice of bread, the wooden cup that kept pride soft, and the wagons that turned numbers into meals. These were Attila's pieces, moved in daylight. The night held the same care guards who watched rivers, riders who measured time by stars, a leader who preferred a promise that could be renewed to a fire that burned only once. Our next steps will follow scouts across bridges and through valleys where supply and weather wrote in larger letters than any treaty. For now, breathe, and keep one gentle truth near. The chessboard was never the goal. The herd behind the tent was. The road into the Balkans did not begin with a shout. It began with scouts moving like quiet ink across a blank page. They counted fords and fresh grass, tasted water at streams that had names only herders used, and marked where bridges were watched by sleepy eyes. When riders returned, they spoke in short lines. This valley is open. That hill carries smoke. That town has wagons near its gate. Attila listened, the way a man listens for weather. Then the wagons rolled, families and herds in the wide river of the Confederation, and beside them the lighter current of chosen riders who could flow ahead and fold back. In a moment, you will see how invasion, up close, looked less like lightning and more like a traveling camp with a plan. Spring made the first decisions. If rains were heavy, wagons took the high ridges and the riders took the smoother meadow, because hooves could love mud in a way wheels could not. Grain in the fields was not yet ripe, so supply meant herds and stores, and deals along the wayfarer traded for peace. Iron bought from a smith who preferred coin to certainty. Fortified cities were notes to be read rather than goals to be swallowed. When a town's market stayed open and a magistrate stepped out with measured gifts, the river bent around it and moved on. When a gate closed and a small garrison pretended not to hear, pressure built until someone with keys remembered the cost of repairs. In a moment, a Roman road will rise like a stone river and change everyone's gait. Stone roads were a gift and a temptation. They carried carts faster than field paths, but they also carried news. Attila moved near them without becoming their prisoner. He let a column touch them in the cool of morning, and then slide away into tracks no map could hold. The Balkans learned the rhythm, a strong wave at a fort to open talks, a thin spread into farms to remind governors that protection was a service bought with fairness, and then a return to the path that led to a treaty table. Many historians think his most severe Balkan campaign pushed far and returned with gold rather than ruins as its measure, because the goal was always the herd behind the horizon. In a moment, the city with the strongest walls will appear like a hill of baked brick. Constantinople stood at the end of many roads, and its walls looked like a mountain built by careful hands. Earthquakes had shaken them. Men repaired them. Even a bold rider could listen and decide that patience would pay better than ladders. Pressure therefore lived in the lands around the city, rather than against its stones. Towns farther west and north felt the hand that turned numbers and treaties, and envoys learned the route to the timber hall by memory. You can imagine the Danube, again, wide and practical, watching coins cross it with the calm of a ferryman who knows both banks. In a moment, the road will swing toward a different theater, and the word goal will become a plain with many names. Moving west meant meeting new patterns of river and town. The Rhine offered crossings at old Roman points that locals still loved, and here scouts mattered most. They looked for shallow places where wagons would not float, and for bends where a bridge of boats could be tied without angering the current. When the crossing was made, it did not feel like a wall breaking. It felt like two rooms joined. Houses along the way sent out bread and caution in equal measures. Letters moved faster than hooves, and by the time the river was behind them, the news had outpaced the lead riders by a day. In a moment, the first cities of Gaul will appear in the distance, and we will walk close without harsh detail. Some towns shut their gates and watched the horizon. Others chose terms and sent out elders with bread, wine, and a plea for quiet. Attila preferred doors that could open and close on command, rather than doors that had to be rebuilt. When a city held out, he tested it with method, rather than fewer scouts measuring walls. Engineers borrowed from subject peoples setting simple machines. Negotiations offered as a way to save both time and timber. He stepped round many stones, and followed the food. The picture from above would look like water respecting rocks while swelling the ground between them. The aim was to reach the place where important roads met, and to write new numbers where old orders had sat too long. In a moment, the name of a plain will arrive, and with it the hush that comes before too large. Groups breathe the same air. The fields we call the Catalonian plains sit in stories like a table set for a slow meal. The exact spot is debated by scholars, but the idea is clear. A wide place where grain grew and lines could form. A Roman general named Itius gathered allies with the practiced hand of a man who knew which threads to pull. Visigoths came with their king. Small groups from other peoples joined, and the road dust held many opinions. Attila met them not as a storm, but as a planner meeting another planner. Both sides looked for rises in the land, for dry patches where feet would hold, for shadows that would not confuse the eye at dusk. In a moment, we will look at what such a meeting meant in lived terms. Without loud words, before lines touched, tents still stood, fires still burned, and horses still needed water. Messengers moved between leaders like ants, mapping a picnic. The talks, if any, were thin and formal, for this day chose a different kind of arithmetic. Yet even then, no one forgot supply. Wagons were drawn up behind the chosen ground. Spare mounts were placed where hands could find them. Women and children, who had traveled with the moving town, were guided to safety behind a low ridge. It is possible to imagine Attila awake long before dawn, walking the edge of his camp, placing a palm on a horse's shoulder, as if listening for a deeper weather. In a moment, we will stand far enough back to see what a battle on such a plain tried to decide without counting losses. The aim in these fields was not to erase the other side. It was to keep them from using this meeting as a ladder over you. Whoever held the center gained a page in the story. Whoever broke a wing taught the other that supply would not flow the same way tomorrow. On that day in Gaul, the coalition managed to halt Attila's forward push, and the death of a Gothic king added a heavy shadow to the evening. Yet Attila's camp did not vanish. He did not dissolve into panic. He drew his wagons into a circle, as steppe people had done for centuries when a knight asked for caution, and he waited. The decision that followed was quiet. The goal was not this field. The goal was the season after. In a moment, we will back away with him and watch the art of leaving without being chased. Retreat can be a kind of sentence that a leader writes with care. He kept scouts on the edges to bite at any pursuers without inviting a rush. He measured bridges and burned none he planned to need again. He kept the pace slow enough that wagons did not scatter and quick enough that gossip at markets could not catch up. This is not a story of a broken army. It is a story of a moving city that chose to sleep somewhere safer. The plain became a hinge in memory, because both sides needed a hinge. The coalition to say we stood, and Attila to say we turned when it suited us. Many historians think this balance explains the long echo of that name. In a moment, a quieter reason for the turn will join the picture: food and sickness. Those quiet generals. Gaul in that year had suffered its own weather. Spring floods, strained stores, and the heavy breath of disease travel in old writings like shadows that sit at the edge of the page. A great moving camp eats more than a single fortress can store, and drinks more than one river can offer at a pinch. If fodder thinned and fevers rose, prudence spoke louder than drums. To a steppe mind, there was no shame in changing a plan, because grass and water changed their minds. The wooden cup returns here as a symbol. Plain needs make plain decisions. In a moment, we will return to the Balkans one last time to see how similar patterns repeated there with a different cast. When pressure returned to the Eastern Empire in other seasons, the steppes looked familiar. Scouts felt for weak points, like fingers along a cord. Wagons found the paths that the weather allowed. Towns were tested for their willingness to trade silence for safety. And behind the movement, the aim was always to roll numbers upward. The treaty table. Even when a campaign bit hard, its purpose fed back into tribute and pasture. A writer who loves marble might call this punishment. A rider who loves grass might call it maintenance. Both can be true without cancelling each other. In a moment, the picture will soften into the logic of speed itself, which mattered more than walls all along. Speed here did not mean reckless rushing. It meant the ability to decide today and arrive where that decision mattered before the other side had finished asking permission. It meant columns that could split and join like streams. Scouts who could report without losing themselves to curiosity, and a leader who could sit in a saddle for hours while thinking about river levels too. Weeks ahead, speed kept choices open. It made allies consider silence instead of bravery, and made enemies choose gates instead of fields. The field in Gaul remains as a story because it is easy to draw, but the true picture of Attila's strength was the space between such drawings, where hooves and wagons changed minds without touching stone. In a moment, we will carry this calm view into Italy, where a march met hunger and talk, and where a quiet meeting with a bishop would later turn into a legend shaped more by memory than by dust. Italy arrived as a change in light. The same riders, the same wagons, the same careful scouts, but the air felt different when they crossed the river that Romans had loved for centuries. The roads were older, the bridges broader, and the town's war walls the color of baked bread. Early summer carried a sweet smell from fields already heavy with promise. Attila moved the way he had moved in goal testing, listening, stepping where grass and water allowed. The wooden cup we keep seeing in our minds might as well have hung from his saddle, a reminder that plain needs guide loud plans. In a moment, the high arc of the Alps and the low flat of the Po will explain why this march was never going to be a simple line. Aquileia sat like a gate on the northeast, and its walls were stubborn. Siege in this telling is a quiet word, not ladders and shouting, but weeks of measuring, cutting timber, shifting ground, and waiting for a town's breath to grow short. Many historians think the struggle there cost time and strength that would be missed later. When the gate finally opened to the logic of pressure, messages ran ahead of the camp like birds, and other towns in the plain made fast decisions about doors. Markets sent out gifts, magistrates practiced the art of apology, storehouses learned new owners for a season. In a moment, we will step away from stones and feel the larger forces that were already shaping the end of this road. The valley can be kind and cruel in the same week. Water lies close to the skin of the earth. Summer heat kneels on it. Insects rise, fevers follow. Herds need pasture that does not sour, and wagons need dry ground that does not pretend to be firm in the morning and prove treacherous by noon. Grain was there, yes, but harvest was not yet complete. And moving a whole confederation eats more than any one landscape enjoys sharing. Many historians think a sickness rode the plain that year, not dramatic in any 1 hour, but steady in the way only marsh fever can be. In a moment, you will see how this slow pressure joins hands with distant news to bend a decision. News from the east crossed mountain and river. The other emperor, Marcian, had sent men north of the Danube to trouble Hunnic ground. Tribute lines shook. Winter plans wrote themselves in angry ink. Chiefs at home would expect their leader to appear before frost, to show the camp could not be pushed like a tent in a wind. Attila always balanced the tables, the one in front of him and the one where his herds grazed far away. Italy offered short pride and slow hunger. The Danube offered long memory. To a rider raised by motion, this choice did not feel like surrender. It felt like steering. In a moment, a meeting by a river will give later centuries a story to polish. The person who arrived from Rome wore a different kind of armor-cloth voice, authority that lived in the respective crowds. This was Leo, a bishop whose letters still read like well-built bridges. He came with others. Some say a high official, some say a knot of senators. The exact company is hazy, the mood not. A river many place it at the Mincio Sao. The two parties face one another on flat ground under a summer sky. Bread and courtesy went first, as always, then quiet. The wooden cup returns here as a symbol again. Picture a plain bowl in one man's hand, and a careful blessing in the other's. Voice. In a moment, we will listen for what might have been said, knowing most of it was never written. It is likely that Leo asked for mercy for the towns that still breathed, and offered reasons that would let both sides keep their dignity. He could remind Attila that famine loomed, and disease could unmake victories. He could promise that gold would be lighter than more broken walls. He could suggest that the honor of a leader is sometimes in the hand he holds still, not the one he raises. Attila did not need a sermon to see the math. He needed a bridge to walk that math without appearing weak. The bishop could be that bridge. Many historians think the parley was practical theater on both sides, the kind of scene that makes sense to a people who love treaties. In a moment, later memory will add paint to this simple board. A story rose afterward that saints were seen beside Leo, stern as statues, and that Attila bowed to a vision more than to a voice. It is a good story. It has the right weight for an age that read signs in the sky as easily as we read signs on a road. It does not have to be false to be beside the point. People often explain large, sensible choices with bright symbols because symbols are easier to carry. The real force is farther thin, fevers thick. Letters from the Danube urgent already sat in the tent. The meeting gave them a form that human hearts could honor. In a moment, we return to the wagons, because a piece must be loaded and driven. Like a chest of coin, leaving Italy needed craft. A camp does not simply turn around. It coils and uncoils. Scouts checked bridges, counted ferries, spoke to town elders who would be less brave once a column's dust moved away. The aim was to move without turning the road behind into a chain of small wars. Itius, the Roman general, who had played the wide game in Gaul, measured distance with the patience of a farmer watching weather. He did not press too close. He understood that a foe who wants to go is safest when allowed to go on a path that carries his weight without breaking. In a moment, the march will find cooler air, and the plains fever will release its grip. When the first higher ridges were behind, men breathed differently. The sound of insects softened. Horses stopped, tossing their heads at shadows that came. With the damp, that relief did not erase the memory of Italy, but it made the choice to leave feel right in the body, not just on a map. Tribute could be discussed again from a position of strength at the river. Winter camps could be set with grain counted before snow. The eastern raids could be met with a leader present, not a letter. The wooden cup flashes again here, almost playfully a reminder that leaders drink the season they are given, not the one they wish. In a moment, we will pause and read how Roman pens wrote this ending. Roman writers loved moral endings. Some say Leo's holiness alone turned the horde. Others put the credit with Attila's steady hand. A few mention plague and hunger like a frown in the margin. The truth sits calmly among them. Leo gave a face to reason. Itius gave room for the reason to work. The land itself advised retreat. The Danube called for a ruler who had trained on a moving map since childhood. It was a day for steering, not for slogans. Many historians think this was his most prudent turn, because it preserved strength for bargaining later and kept the Confederation's heart beating. In a moment, you will hear the quieter coda what Italy kept after that summer. Italy kept a story. Towns rebuilt, markets reopened. A bishop's statue would one day stand in paintings before a horseman whose name could frighten a child into bedtime. People need stories that tame fear. They also kept bruised roads and thinned barns, the quiet costs that any large movement leaves. But the land remained itself, and the empire did not end under those hooves. Attila returned to his white court with more knowledge about walls, water, and fevers than he had carried in. We return to our first hook. Did he prefer gold to The answer nods once more. In a moment, we will step away from Italy and look at belief and omens, the mood music of his camp, and how a title like Divine Punisher can grow from the seeds of fear and the soil of politics. For tonight, it is enough to hold the scene by the river, a bishop in travel dust, a ruler with plain habits, a small space between two large worlds where common sense could sit and be respected. The march slowed, then turned, not by magic alone, but by every quiet force we have felt along this journey: grass and grain, weather and word, pride and prudence. If you breathe with that rhythm, you can hear how the steps lessons found their way into Italy. Move when the map is kind, stop when it is wise, and choose a future that feeds your people better than a story that burns bright and dies. In a moment, the campfires will circle again under open sky, and the next chapter will lift its eyes to the signs men look for when the night has more to say than the day. Night after, Italy felt older than other nights. The air over the camp was cool and the sky looked close enough to touch, a plain of dark with bright points like quiet fires in a far village. Men finished simple tasks by lamplight, and then leaned back to watch the slow paths of stars they knew by heart. Somewhere, a healer burned herbs that smelled sharp and clean. A boy turned a small amulet in his fingers and said nothing, because saying nothing before sleep could be its own kind of prayer. In a moment, we'll listen for what the Huns likely believed, and how belief moved a camp without anyone lifting a spear. Many historians think the Huns honored the open world, sky above, the ground that carried hooves, the water that made grass possible. The words change from people to people, but the idea is steady: a high heaven that sees, an earth that feeds, and signs that weave between them like messages written in wind. A shaman or healer might mutter over smoke, watch the way a horse flicked its ears, read the shape of a dream, and offer a small action to balance a worry. Pour a little milk on the ground before a long ride. Tie a knot in a bridle to catch bad luck. The practices were modest, like polite knocks on a large door. In a moment, we'll walk into the big tent and see how a leader used these small manners to steady many hearts. Attila did not preach, but he understood mood. Before a risky move, he let simple rites breathe. Libations poured on the soil, bread broken in a certain order, a cup lifted to the sky, as if to make eye contact with the high watching. He allowed the healer's fire to burn where men could see it and smell its certainty. He heard omens the way he heard scouts, more data, not destiny. If a bird crossed left to right at dawn, perhaps the column left at the second hour, not the first. If thunder walked far off, camps were pitched on higher ground without a speech. Belief became logistics with a soft face. In a moment, a sharper story from a later writer will place a famous object in his hand. A 6th century writer told a tale that Attila found a sacred sword in a field, a blade of the war god that the earth itself pushed up for him. The story is grand. It explains power with a single symbol anyone can picture. A leader chosen by iron. Many historians treat it as a legend with a core that reflects how people felt about his rise. Not a police report, but you can see how useful it would be. A camp hungry for a sign. A found sword says, "This path is not only clever, it is blessed." For a rider raised to read sky and steppe, such a tale could anchor a season of risk. In a moment, we'll place that sword beside the wooden cup we keep returning to and watch the balance. The wooden cup said, "I am plain." The sword story said, "We are chosen." Put together, they made a leader who could both calm pride and charge courage. He could sit at a feast with simple ware, and then ride out under a banner that reminded men of a gift from the earth. Neither image needed shouting. They worked away a steady drum work set a pulse, then let bodies find it did. Even the songs at night, the ones that praised ancestors and named good hunts, served as low hymns to a shared past without trapping anyone in a temple. In a moment, we'll leave the camp's center and follow belief into everyday tasks, because ritual hid in chores as well as in stories. Herds were counted with a murmur that sounded like prayer. New foals were brushed with hands that had rinsed in clean water. Before a river crossing, riders touched the surface with a palm. After, someone always thanked the bank for not crumbling. When a child sickened, a small thread might be tied at a tent's edge, a promise to return and untie it when the fever went. The healer's bag held herbs, bone tools, and songs. Nothing here is dramatic. Everything is intimate. A camp that moved often used quick rites that traveled well. Many historians think the Huns did not build large temple places. The sky was roof enough. In a moment, we'll step over the river and ask why neighbors began to call Attila a punisher of God. Roman and Christian writers reached for meaning when trouble came. Drought, war, disease, these were not just events. They were lessons in their view, and someone had to be the ruler's ruler. The phrase "scourge of God" was not invented for Attila. Sermons had used the idea before to explain other disasters, but his pressure on the empire, arriving again and again like a season, made the line fit him too neatly to resist. To a bishop preaching in a shaken town, it helped to say, "A divine rod is upon us. We must correct our ways." To a court defending its budgets, it helped to say, "Even heaven is testing us." The title grew because it's useful, not because Attila issued it. In a moment, we'll watch how his own camp received such labels when they floated back across the Danube. Words from the empire reached Hunnic hearths through traders and hostages. Laughter may have met some of them. A people that poured milk for the earth would not need a Roman phrase to explain why a fort paid its debts. Yet pride has ears. If neighbors call your leader the hammer of heaven, you might let the rumor walk through your tents on nights when courage needs a taller story. Attila himself, if we trust the quiet tone of those who met him, did not lean on borrowed names. He leaned on schedules, routes, and the old grammar of gifts and oaths. But he did not push away useful ore. In a moment, we'll return to omens as tools, how signs became staff notes in a house without paper. Clouds can be memos. A ring around the moon moves a departure to dawn. A dream shared by three men in the same night of a river running backward, say, becomes a pause to check ferry ropes and watch for shifting banks. A lame foal might be read as a warning to spread weight among more wagons. For an army that wrote little, omen and proverb were how policy traveled from leader to line. Without parchment, even skeptics in the camp played along, because a shared sign makes obedience feel like belief, not fear. Many historians think this blend pragmatism covered with thin gold leaves of ritual kept a morale soft and strong at once. In a moment, we'll ask what Attila himself believed about himself. We cannot open his heart. We can only read the room. He allowed rites, welcomed healers, and listened to men who watched birds and bones. He kept his own habits plain, which often means a person knows there is a higher watcher and does not wish to draw lightning. He accepted songs that praised him, but he anchored power in very earthly circuits of tribute and kin. A man raised to count horses before counting coins is unlikely to think he can replace the sky. Yet a man who has been told by enemies that he is a rod of heaven can learn to sit in that borrowed light when it helps him negotiate. The balance is simple and human. In a moment, a comet and an eclipse will visit the page, because people then read the same sky we do now. If a comet burned across a night, every camp for 1,000 miles would talk about it by morning. If the sun grew thin behind a strange shadow, even a confident rider would feel smaller for an hour. Such moments knit the world. A Roman farmer and a Hunnic herdsman could point up and agree that something large had spoken. Leaders used these shared feelings to shape days. Wait, someone would say after a sky like that. Go. Someone else would answer when the sign felt like a door opening. Many historians think timing around such events was as much about crowd psychology as about cosmic messages. But on the ground, in a tent, the effect was real. Calm, focus, patience. In a moment, we'll name one quiet ritual that many sources hint at rather than describe. Oath-making mattered. Swords planted in earth, hands on iron ore on a fire's heat, words spoken in a circle where eyes witnessed and memory became law. A broken oath in such a room did not just risk a fine, it risked the weather of the group. Attila's court used oaths to make chiefs into cousins and envoys into neighbors, at least for a season. It is a simple insight that still feels new. People will walk farther for a promise they watched being born. No marble needed. The tent's roof was enough church for honesty when men agreed to let it be so. Bards and bishops worked with different tools but shared a craft, turning fear into tales. A Gothic singer could stretch an enemy into a giant so that his people's courage grew by meeting him. A Roman preacher could shrink a victory by calling it mercy from above. The name Divine Punisher sounded fine in both mouths, for opposite reasons. Over time, echoes piled up, and the man at the center blurred. Our calmer walk shows him in focus again. A rider who trusted omens as weather, not orders. A host who let ceremonies breathe. A planner who did not reject a halo if it cast useful light on a treaty. In a moment, we'll cross from mood to money, because belief can carry a day, but silver carries a winter. Before we go, keep one picture close. The stars over a steppe camp look like the inside of a tent that someone pricked with 1,000 neat holes. Smoke rises. A healer sings quietly. A cup of milk tips toward the ground, and a leader steps out to breathe the same night air as everyone else. He looks up, as you would, and measures not destiny, but distance. How many nights to the river? How many wagons need new axles? How many horses ready for the long run? The sky above may bless or scold. The earth below may answer, but between them a human hand still ties the knot that holds a people together. We return to our quiet question from the hook about the title that others gave him, and we see now how a useful name can ride on honest wind. In a moment, we will open the leather purses and the grain stores, follow tribute from chest to herd to workshop, and watch how a moving court fed itself, without burning the ground that paid it. Wealth in his world did not live in stone rooms. It moved with hooves and wheels. Think of herds as a bank that breathed and multiplied, of wagons as rolling storehouses with felt for walls, of tribute as a steady river of coin that turned into fodder, iron, and favors the same week it arrived. When gold crossed the Danube in sacks, it did not sleep long in chests. It went out again as wages, gifts, and tools, like seeds taken from a pouch and pressed into many hands. The wooden cup we keep seeing in our minds fits this economy well. It reminds you that the center can be plain while the edges thrive. In a moment, we'll open a leather purse and see where each coin might walk next. A steward weighed silver on scales, with honest pans, and then measured out grain from a wagon that smelled like summer even in winter. A chief who rode in brought home animals, cloth, or iron instead of stories only. If a smith needed new tongs, the coin paid for that and for the coal to heat them. If a captain's cousin married, the silver found its way into blankets and bridles. Tribute became tools, and tools made more tribute possible, because a well-armed, well-fed camp could negotiate from strength. Many historians think this cycle, more than any single conquest, explains why the Hunnic web grew tight and stayed smooth for years. In a moment, we will step into a workshop where iron and leather turned money into muscle. The forge was low and bright, and the air felt like hard work. Iron bars sat on the dirt like sleeping dogs. A pipe brought breath to coals. The metal sang when struck and told the smith when to stop. Arrowheads cooled in neat rows. Spear sockets waited like cups to drink their wooden shafts. Knives wore handles of antler or simple wood. Next door, the leatherworkers softened hides with oil and bent them to belts, reins, and cases for bows. Stitch by stitch, wealth took shape that could ride, fight, and endure rain. Some artisans were born under those tents. Others were hired, ransomed, or wooed from the empire's edge, with pay and protection. In a moment, the work will leave the shop and meet the road. Merchants loved a safe road more than any anthem. If riders kept bandits away, and if a market opened where promised, news carried that safety farther than banners ever could. Many traders learned that the fastest way from the Black Sea to the interior was under Hunnic eyes, where a tax was clear. A token was issued, and a caravan was watched the way a herdsman watches his flock. The fee was not small, but it was predictable. It included, as we might say now, shipping and handling. A guard rode with you through bad grass. No paperwork to frame on a wall, but a knot in a cord and a steward's memory could be better than wax. In a moment, you will feel a market day rise near a river ford. Stalls appeared like mushrooms after rain. A table of salt, a pile of combs, a basket of needles, a row of cups that caught light like small ponds. Grain was measured by the bowl, cloth by the arm, horses by the mile of their gait. Hunnic stewards kept order with calm hands and a few rules. Fires at the edge, animals tethered by the bank, no knives drawn within the ring of stalls. The fee was collected with a short look and a tap of the ledger. If trouble came, a chief's guard arrived without theatre, moved a man out of the ring, and life went on. Markets love such quiet. In a moment, we'll follow one mule train as it leaves with a promise tucked behind the saddle. Protection did not end at the market gate. A stamped token or a tied knot meant a rider had paid for peace on the next stretch. One guard might follow for a day and hand you to another the next, like passing a torch that is really a promise. If a mule went lame and a load had to be shifted, the guard and the steward found a solution that did not turn into a story later. The cost of theft was high. The cost of fairness was lower. Many historians think this reputation for tidy passage helped draw more trade into Hunnic hands, and that more trade meant less need to waste strength on fields of stone. In a moment, we will see how barter and coin lived side by side without quarrels. Silver counted well when paying smiths or sealing tribute, but hides, horses, and grain held their own value. A trader might offer cloth and take home 15 arrowheads, 4 pots of salt, and a foal promised in spring. A steward recorded both the items and the balances due later. The ledger in this world could be a mind as much as a book. Debts cleared at the next fair when rivers allowed. Where the empire loved a seal, the steppe loved a witness. A man with a good memory and a good name was better than a bailiff. The wooden cup returns here again, simple, sturdy, known. It's a good image for a wallet that breathes. In a moment, we will walk in from the road to the herd, because that is where value slept every night. Horses with a golden river you could ride. Short, strong, quick to learn. They were counted at dusk with the same care a city counts lamps. Mares meant milk for the camp, and new foals next spring. Geldings meant steady backs for long rides. Stallions meant pride and careful ropes. Sheep gave wool and meat. Cattle gave strength for wagons, and all three gave hides to feed the leather bench. Wealth grew 4 legs and demanded grass in return. The herders were paid with gifts, with first choice of strong tack, and with the warm authority that comes to people who can calm a spooked mount with a voice. In a moment, we will step into winter, because a moving economy must learn to pause. Without breaking. Cold months did not kill trade. They changed its shape. Wagons sat closer, felt walls grew thicker, and dried meat and curds took the place of fresh. Tribute paid in autumn was stretched with care. Tools were repaired. Arrowheads piled up like a winter crop. Traders still came, their goods wrapped against frost, and found that a camp makes a steady customer, even when snow lies thin on the ground. Some crafts thrived best in the cold string making, fletching, stitching since hands in the lap, like to be busy, futures were promised in winter, a colt in spring, a delivery at the first fair, a hunt in the thaw. In a moment, we will look at how information itself became a kind of currency that bought safety and goodwill. News traveled with caravans like a second cargo. A price shift on the Black Sea could move buckets of salt along the Danube. A change in an imperial tax could make wine more or less likely to appear under a wagon cover. Traders who brought good news of a clear ford, a kind official, a fort that liked fair dealing, received quiet favors the next time they needed shelter. Hostages who returned with new languages could serve as guides for both coins and words. Attila's court understood this well and paid attention to rumor without being ruled by it. Many historians think the exchange of information greased the same wheels that gold pushed, and sometimes did it more cheaply. In a moment, we will notice how theft was handled when it slipped past the guard's eye. A camp that depends on safe markets must be hard on their enemies. Thieves were not paraded. They were removed from the ring of trust quickly and cleanly. Compensation came first. The victim received goods or coin to make the loss right. The thief faced penalties that could include loss of status, expulsion from a market, or, on long roads, the terrible sentence of being sent on without escort. The message was simple: this house earns its bread from safe roads. The wooden cup teaches the same lesson by another route plane, trusted, always in the right hand. In a moment, we will return to the tribute chest, because even moving courts need some quiet savings. Not every coin left the purse in the same season. A portion stayed as reserve for sickness, bad grass, a smith's hearth, gone cold by mistake. A chief's sudden need for horses after a storm scattered the herd. The reserve bought time, which then bought better rates. It also paid for gestures that seem small and carry far. A gift of grain to a hungry village near a ford. A new roof plank for a tavern that agreed to shelter Hunnic riders. A good doctor for a sick hostage whose health meant a treaty later. Savings became stories, and stories became a mote of goodwill. Silk did not pour across the steppe like water, but thin streams reached even here. A bolt of strange cloth might appear in a market and make eyes widen. A jar of spice might scent a corner of a hall and make talk. Traders from farther east, or goods that had passed through many hands, told of roads beyond roads, and the Hunnic web learned to plug into those distant currents without trying to own them. A caravan that felt safe in this middle world came back with friends next season. That was the goal, not a monopoly. In a gentle way, the camp became a hinge between worlds. In a moment, we will carry these quiet mechanics back to the title from our hook, because the divine Punisher sat on a very human economy. The name others used for him floated above a ground full of bags, bowls, ledgers, and rope. Punishment does not feed a winter, planning does. The camp made gifts into loyalty, loyalty into riders, riders into safe roads into trade, and trade into the next year's strength. The wooden cup and the tribute chest sat in the same tent without arguing. If a sermon in a city called him a rod from heaven, a steward in the camp called him a good payer of wages. We return to our earlier question why merchants loved Hunnic roads, and we have answered it. Because fees were clear, guards were real, and promises kept moving with the caravan. In a moment, we will soften our gaze and read how stories about him were written, stretched, and set to music by people who loved fear in theater. For now, picture evening at the edge of a fair. The last animals have been counted. The last coin has been weighed. A trader warms his hands at a low fire and smiles at how neatly the day ran. A steward closes his ledger with a small thump that sounds like reassurance. In the hall, a simple cup lifts and lowers, and a quiet word sends next. Week's goods to the right roads. Wealth without cities looks like this. Many small, safe acts, repeated iron and leather worked in the same breath as salt and song. A moving web that asks only for grass, water, and respect for the rules that make strangers into neighbors. In a moment, we will sit with Roman pens and Gothic singers and watch how this plain picture turned into a larger shadow. Stories about Attila began while he was alive and grew larger after he was gone. Roman pens painted him with a heavy brush, because fear and politics made dark colors useful. Gothic singers shaped him into a giant, because a big enemy makes your own heroes look taller. Later, epics stitched these threads into cloaks of legend that could warm many winters. Under all of that cloth, a quieter shape remains. The planner with the wooden cup, the rider who liked treaties that paid on time, the host who kept order in a moving town. Holding those two pictures at once is the real work. In a moment, we'll sit beside a Roman writer who actually met him and follow his calm lines back into the tent. An envoy named Priscus visited the Hunnic court and left notes that feel like walking through the camp in soft sandals. He wrote of a timber hall in the open, of silver plates set before guests, and of a leader who chose plain wood. He noticed jokes and music at table, but also an edge of discipline that did not allow drink to rule the night. He found men who spoke several languages, and who understood gifts as well as spears. If you close your eyes and breathe with his pages, you meet the Attila we have kept returning to, not a monster but a manager who liked results. Priscus did not always admire, he simply observed. In a moment, we will contrast this clear window with later windows that were colored on purpose. A learned man named Jordanes wrote later about the wars of Goths and Huns, and his pages moved events around like scenery in a theater. He relied on earlier accounts in memory, and he filled gaps with speeches nobody actually wrote down at the time. He gave us useful outlines and some bright images, but he also helped set the stage for a taller Attila, who could cast a long shadow into centuries that needed him as symbol. Many historians think we should read those lines with care, using them as maps with missing roads, rather than as photographs. The difference between these two voices, Priscus at the table and later writers in libraries, already shows how a legend takes its first breath. In a moment, singers will enter, and the room will change again. Epic songs in later Europe turned Attila into Etzel or Otley, a host in a grand hall where betrayal and revenge walked in and out, like guests in fine boots. In those poems, he sometimes looks generous, sometimes cruel, often larger than weather. He marries queens who belong to other stories. He sits at feasts where heroes end their days. And his hall becomes a stage for the kind of moral knots that audiences enjoy untangling. These epics keep a few grains of truth, the sense of a rich court that can command attention, the discipline of a strict host, but they dress those grains in costumes that fit the needs of their own age. The songs are good, but they are not minutes from a meeting. In a moment, we will watch the title Divine Punisher change clothes as it walks from sermon to saga. In Christian sermons, Scourge of God explained why bad times visited good people. It made suffering feel like a test that a community could pass by reforming itself. Attach that phrase to a man who arrives in dust and leaves with gold, and you have a story that helps citizens accept new taxes and bishops preach patience. When the phrase wandered into folk tales, it became a crown that gave fear a face. It is neat, memorable, and portable, but it tells us more about the listeners than the writer. We return to our wooden cup quietly and see how the simple object argues with the title. A man who chooses wood at a table full of gold is not hunting thunder for breakfast. In a moment, the sword story will knock and will open the door gently. Later, tale claimed the earth gave Attila a sacred sword, a sign that the war god favored him. It is a handsome picture, a leader bent to pick up destiny from the soil. It may echo a real discovery of an old blade, or it may be pure theater. Either way, it served a purpose. It told anxious followers that their path was chosen, and it told neighbors that treaties with him were signed, not only with ink but with fate. The sword sits on one side of the scale, the wooden cup sits on the other. Between them, the truth balances. A planner who used symbols without being swallowed by them. In a moment, a gentler myth will arrive, one that peeks into his tent and looks for silk and jewels. Some later writers and travelers imagined a court drowning in gold, as if every saddle sang when it moved. The eyewitness tells a softer tale. There was display for guests, yes, silver dishes, rich gifts, but the host's own habits stayed plain. This mixture makes sense for a coalition leader, to hold many chiefs. You show wealth around them while personally refusing to outshine them at every moment. Think of a modern director who dresses simply at a gala so donors can sparkle. The image works because it fits human pride. When you hear about endless treasure in every corner, smile and remember the careful ledger and the felt walls. In a moment, the stories will step closer to his face and claim they know what he looked like. Descriptions of Attila's appearance vary and may say more about the writer than the man. Some lines make him short and stocky with a broad chest. Others paint his eyes as lively or small. Some even lean into stereotypes that reflect old anxieties rather than accurate portraits. What we can hold is plain. He rode hard, he hosted often, and years in the weather shape any face into something spare and practical. The best mirror is behavior, and that mirror shows a person who preferred to be understood, not adored. If you ever read a line that makes him a creature instead of a human, place Prisca's page beside it and let the two argue. In a moment, we will watch how enemies used the fear of his speed as a pen to write their own virtues. Roman generals needed victories that citizens could understand. When they held him at a field in Gaul, the story needed to make a hinge out of a long campaign. When he left Italy, the story needed a holy hand to guide him so the audience could cheer something visible. That is not cheating. It is storytelling in service of civic peace, but it does blur the person behind the plot. If we step back and let the dust settle, we see the same choices we traced earlier: food sickness, letters from the Danube, costumes borrowed from statues. In a moment, we'll turn to small myths that clung to his daily life and see which ones survived the daylight. One rumor says he never laughed loudly, only smiled, as if joy had to stay disciplined. That fits the host who kept drink in its place and did not let night run away with the hall. Another says he loved hunting more than feasting, which also matches the steppe habit of finding pride in skill under the sky. A third suggests he listened more than he spoke, and we have met that man already at the treaty table. These are little myths that feel plausible because they match the web of choices we can verify. When a story has him devouring a city like a wolf in a fable, we can enjoy the image and then return to the ledger, where tribute numbers rise in known steps. In a moment, the biggest flare of legend will reach us, the end of his life, and we will touch it without leaning too hard. People told many versions of his death. Some said a sudden medical event took him in the night after a celebration. Some draped the scene with romance and warning. Some preferred a simple turn of fortune, without enemies in the room. We will walk through those choices soon, but here, in the room of myth, it helps to notice why endings grow fast. A powerful figure makes a wide silence when he goes, and communities rush to fill it with meaning. Death scenes become mirrors. Roman pens saw punishment for pride. Steppe mouths might have seen the end of a long ride under a sky that takes everyone. In the end, in a moment, burial will bring a different kind of embroidery, the kind that involves rivers, coffins, and secrecy. There is a tale that his body was placed in multiple coffins, iron, silver, gold, and that a river was briefly turned from its bed to hide the grave before it was returned to its course. It is a strong story, part engineering feat, part poem. It says, "This man was a nation. Even water moved for him." Many historians treat it as a grand legend that may sit on a smaller truth, a secret burial, guarded and unmarked, to prevent enemies from making a trophy. Secrecy fits a moving people who did not plant many stones. Whether or not a river ever stepped aside, the wish behind the tale is clear. Let the leader rest where only earth knows. In a moment, we will let myth and record shake hands and ask what remains in the center of the circle. What remains is a practical genius for movement, negotiation, and morale, wrapped in symbols that audiences carried more easily than ledgers. The Divine Punisher label served preachers. The sword story served courage. The plain cup served politics. The river burial served pride and grief. If this seems like too many masks, think of a modern public figure whose weekday emails and weekend headlines tell different tales depending on the reader. Human beings live inside stories others tell about them. Attila's gift was to use enough of those stories to feed his people and ignore the ones that did not buy grass. In a moment, we'll join him for the last time at the camp's edge, where life turns into memory. Imagine an evening near the Danube, when talk runs low. The forge glows, the mares are counted, the children sleep, and the host steps out to feel the night air. He has been called a scourge, a king, a host, a hunter, a demon, a planner. He has answered to his own name when it mattered, and to the Empire's names when it paid. The myths we have toured will soon go their separate ways into poems, sermons, and schoolrooms, but the quiet image from Priscus will go on working, a leader with a simple cup, listening first, setting the tone. We return to our first promise to keep curiosity warm and the pulse low, and we keep it now by refusing to shout our conclusions. In a moment, we'll walk into the final chapter, where endings and echoes meet. The night he did not wake, the scramble for heirs, and the way the web he built loosened like a bowstring after long use. The night he did not wake began like any other celebration. There was a feast, the wooden cup in the host's hand, songs that named old hunts and new hopes, and a new bride brought into a web of kin and treaty. The sources do not agree on the details, and we keep them gentle. Some say he drank and slept, and a sudden bleeding took him. Some say he choked in the dark, others, distant and suspicious, whisper of a hidden hand. What matters most to the camp is simpler. A leader who had steered by weather and coin for years was quiet in the morning. The tent's roof felt lower. In a moment, we will look at what people did first, when a voice like that fell silent. They did what humans always do. They made meaning. One story says he died on his wedding night to a young wife, whose name survives as a faint sap in later writing, so that joy and ending sit together like two bowls on the same mat. Another insists no one else was to blame, that sometimes even riders who have outrun many risks meet an ordinary one. The calmest voices say the camp grieved and moved, because a moving house cannot stand still for long. Men who had watched him lift a simple cup at feasts now lifted the work of the day. Herds were counted, guards took their posts, messengers ran to sons. In a moment, the old stories about burial will arrive, shining and somber. Later, tradition wraps his funeral in metal and river water. The tale goes that a coffin of iron sat inside one of silver, and both inside one of gold. A stack of strength, wealth, and glory. A river, they say, was turned from its bed, the grave laid in the dry path, and then water returned to wash all signs away. Some add a dark coda about the men who dug and filled, that their task ended their road, so that secrecy would be complete. We handle that detail with respect and distance. It lives in legend's shadow, not in the ledger Priscus kept. The point of the story is clear, even if the facts are foggy. Let the earth keep him. Let no enemy use his bones for a flag. In a moment, grief will learn to speak the language of politics. Sons stood where one man had stood, and the web felt the difference at once. Attila had woven many strands, kinsmen, allied chiefs, hostages, tribute, markets into a fabric that held because one hand smoothed it daily. Elok, Dengizik, and Ernok appear in the pages that follow, each with a claim, and a following, each with a memory of a father who liked treaties that paid on time. But confederations prefer single weather. With 3 skies, camps began to pick favorites. Old allies weighed their chances. The empire on the river watched and quietly closed its purse, because tribute often follows confidence, and confidence had gone out to walk. In a moment, we will hear a place name that marks the web's first loud tear, on a field later called Nadau. A coalition of former subjects Gepids under their careful king Ardric, and others who had ridden long under Hunnic chose to break rather than bend again. The battle sits in sources like a hinge no one can stop touching. We do not need to draw it in hard lines. It is enough to say the Hunnic side did not keep the ground that day. Elok is said to have fallen there, and with him fell the easy assumption that the old obedience would return tomorrow. Many historians think the speed that made the web strong also made its unraveling quick. Leaders rose because they could move. Leaders left for the same reason. In a moment, the Danube's banks will show how fast numbers can change when wagons turn away. Tribute from Constantinople had already begun to thin after the Italian turn. With Attila gone, the Eastern Emperor marching in those years had even less reason to send gold north. The logic that had worked so well for a single planner now worked against his heirs. No one fears a divided drum. Without that river of coin, gifts inside the Confederation slowed. Gifts slowing meant loyalty cooled. Cooled loyalty meant more chiefs tried their own roads. The moving court, which had felt like a single body with many hands, now felt like many bodies with similar memories. In a moment, we will sit in one of those smaller tents and listen to what leaders told themselves. They reminded their people of the old steppe truths. The herd is wealth. The river is law. The sky watches. They pointed to the plain cup on their own tables and promised to keep lives simple and strong. Some looked back toward the Danube and tried to reopen talks for smaller, safer payments. Some turned their horses toward new employers and sold their speed to others. The empire, a Gothic king, anyone who could pay. The Huns did not vanish. They changed address. Units that once rode together under one command now rode under many banners. A few names we can follow along later roads. Many simply blend into the long story of frontier soldiers. In a moment, you will see how neighbors' memories grew very tidy as the riders dispersed. Roman pens prefer conclusions. They wrote that a scourge had passed, that God had tested and then restored, that the land could sleep again. It is a kindly ending if you live behind walls, and it helped taxes and temper settle. But along the rivers and the grass, the echo took a different shape. People still told of a leader who kept order in a camp that never sat still, who used a wooden cup to say enough, who knew when to press and when to pause. Gothic singers kept a different Attila live in grand halls where dramas needed a strong host. Both memories chose what they needed. In a moment, we will look at the simple afterlife that lives not in song or sermon, but in roads and habits. Safe roads under watch, clear fees, fair markets at fords. Those ideas did not die. Merchants remembered the routes that ran well and chose similar ones under new guardians. Chiefs who had learned to seat allies by rank without insult took that craft with them to other courts. Even the habit of reading sky and river before pride followed became a kind of wisdom that outlived the name on the banners. The Hunnic web broke, but its knots reappeared elsewhere in quieter forms. This is how influence often travels, not as a flag, but as a method. In a moment, one last legend will walk past, the river burial again, and we will notice what it says about how people wanted this story to rest. If you take the river tale gently, it is a wish for privacy and for return. A leader made of earth and wind returned to them, a current restored to its path, labor done and then forgotten. It is not a bad end for a rider raised under open sky. No mausoleum, no stone speech, just water, soil, and the memory of hooves fading into the kind of quiet that long grass knows. Whether or not a river ever learned that trick, the feeling behind it has lasted. People prefer to imagine that some men rejoin the elements they mastered. In a moment, we will gather the entire arc and see how the title from our hook sits now in your hand. Divine Punisher is lighter than it first looked. It turns out to be a coat other people put on the weather of his career. Sometimes it kept them warm. Sometimes it hid their fear. Under that coat we found a planner with a steady grip, a camp that looked like a moving city, a leader who liked gold on time more than stones in a pile. We watched how a sword legend and a wooden cup could live in one tent without quarreling, and how belief became logistics without needing a temple. We saw how an end can be both sudden and sensible sorrow at dawn, a funeral wrapped in myth, heirs struggling with the arithmetic that once seemed effortless. In a moment, we will close our loops in a soft voice so this ride can let you sleep. Hold him now as a human scale. On one pan, treaties, tribute, markets, patrols, oaths. On the other, stories, omens, titles, epics. The scale tips back and forth as sources speak, but the beam stays calm if we rest it on the steps to lessons. Nothing stays still, and everything connects. His death did not erase those lessons. It only returned them to many small hands. If you listen at the edge of Europe's old roads, you can still hear the echo that made neighbors look over their shoulders, not in dread, but in attention. Someone might be coming who can turn a map into a plan. Someone might pour milk on the ground before riding out. In a moment, if you wish, we can gather the beginning, the middle, and the end into a quiet closing. Answer the questions from the first minute, and fold this story like a felt tent at dawn. We opened with the heavy title and a few quiet questions. Who was the man behind the thunder? Did he love smashed walls or steady gold? Did he sleep under silk in a palace, or under felt in a city that could stand up and walk? And how did it end for him on a field in dust, in a net of plots, or in A soft hush that left even enemies blinking. Now the answers sit in our hands without needing to raise their voices. He was a planner who liked results more than performances. He lifted a plain wooden cup at a table that could glitter, and let that small act set the tone. He lived best where wagons made streets and horses made clocks. He pressed for tribute first, and used force when the mouth turned stubborn, and his end came quietly in the night after a feast, wrapped later in stories that kept grief neat and enemies satisfied. Then carried away by a legend of coffins and a river, asked to forget. Along the way the divine Punisher coat turned out to be something neighbors hung on him. It helped frightened cities make sense of fear, and helped sermons turn hunger into lessons. But under that coat we kept finding the same person, the rider who measured weather, the host who kept order, the diplomat who treated time like coin. He watched omens as a farmer watches clouds, not to worship them, but to pick the right hour to move. He used a sword story when courage needed a banner, and a plain cup when pride needed rest. Even the roads remember him, not as ruins, but as lines that ran safely for a while, because someone believed. Fees should be clear, an escort should arrive on time. Why this matters tonight is simple. History often reaches us as thunder big names, sharp labels, tidy morals, but people who do lasting work tend to sound like heartbeats. They count, they pace, they keep promises, they choose plain tools that keep many hands busy. A legend can stir you for a minute, a method can carry a winter, and when we learn to see both at once, the story that crowds needed and the habits that households used, we hear a calmer lesson. Power that feeds its people looks quieter up close than it does on a coin. If you turn down your own day now, you might borrow his better habits without borrowing his storms. Keep to a steady pace when others rush. Choose the plain tool that works. Read the weather before pride speaks. Hold 2 oaths made in rooms where witnesses breathe. And when a loud label tries to define you, pour milk for the ground you stand on. Lift a simple cup, and answer with your work. The fire on the step is low again. The Danube in our thoughts is smooth. Wagons have become shadows. Horses exhale like bellows falling silent. The wooden cup rests where a hand set it down for the last time, and somewhere a ledger closes with a small, good sound. You can let your breath match that rhythm. Easy in, easy out, and let the night take the weight. If you like this slower way of walking through the past, you can subscribe and we will keep visiting old rooms and wide skies together. For now, let the story fold itself like felt at dawn, and sleep.